Ladies and gentlemen, a very good evening to you and welcome to the latest in our series of Doha debates, coming to you from the Gulf state of Qatar and sponsored by the Qatar Foundation. Despite what they say in some cultures, school isn't always the happiest time of your life. Instead of being encouraged to explore, question and innovate, young people can often be fed hatred and prejudice, their learning restricted by censorship and government propaganda. Such is the reality in many parts of the world, and here too in the Middle East. When it comes to free speech, there are, of course, no absolutes. All states restrict information. But what we're asking tonight is this. Where governments censor educational material for political reasons or to push a particular ideology or a distorted version of history, where key facts are consistently omitted because they're inconvenient or deemed sensitive, where criticism of rulers and ruling parties is stifled, can this type of education have any value at all? Well, our motion tonight, this House believes education is worthless without freedom of speech. And as usual, our panellists come at the topic from very different points of view. Speaking for the motion, Dennis Hayes, founder of Academics for Academic Freedom and Professor of Education at the University of Derby in the UK. And with him, Tariq Ramadan, Professor of Contemporary Islamic Studies at Oxford University. He's also visiting professor at the Faculty of Islamic Studies here in Qatar. Speaking against the motion, Nagla Rizk, Associate Dean for Graduate Studies and Research at the School of Business at the American University in Cairo. She's also Affiliate Scholar at the Yale Law School. And with her, Kevin Watkins. He's Director of the Education for All Global Monitoring Report, led by UNESCO, and a Senior Visiting Research Fellow at the Global Economic Governance Programme at Oxford University. A lot of titles, though. Ladies and gentlemen, that's our panel. And now let me start by asking Dennis Hayes to speak for the motion.
When you're listening to discussions on freedom of speech, the important thing is to listen for the small words. And the word I'd advise you to look for is but. You'll always hear this sentence: I'm in favour of freedom of speech, but. And then will come a list of people whose freedom of speech you don't want to hear. And I want to make the case for free speech in a way you may not have heard before. Free speech has to be defined. When we talk about free speech, we're talking about rational speech, the ability to argue, probe, question, criticise. That's what free speech means. And free speech is just not one freedom amongst other freedoms. It's the foundational freedom. If you don't have freedom of speech, all your other freedoms mean nothing. But people misunderstand constantly the importance of freedom of speech. And it's not about having racists, Islamic extremists, or anyone airing their views. It's about you, the audience. Whether the audience is here in this auditorium, whether it's a classroom, a lecture, or a seminar, it's about having confidence in you as human beings to make up your own mind and not to be told what to think by anybody in authority or by anybody on this panel. It's a great faith in human beings, and I have utter faith in your ability to be rational and to make a decision that is based on the evidence and what you've heard. What I don't want to do is not allow you to hear and not to make up your own mind. Because education that takes place like that is not education. When education begins, it begins by trying to get people to be critical from the first moment. If that doesn't happen, then it's not education you have, it's training.
Could I ask you to wind up?
You're being trained in a way that's no different than animals. Thank you.
Dennis Hayes, thank you very much indeed. Where is this dreamland, this utopia where free speech exists and where you don't have to battle for it? Where there are no buts? Not in Britain, surely.
It's certainly not in Britain. The price of free speech is constant vigilance. You have to constantly fight the battle.
So why are you engaged in this worthless educational process in Britain then, if there's no free speech there? Why don't you resign now and give it up?
Well,
it's clearly worthless.
I'm sure that's what my Vice-Chancellor might say. Why do you keep raising objections? Because someone has to do the Socratic job. Remember the case of Socrates. There's a model to us all.
No, but my point is it's a battle everywhere, isn't it?
Of course.
So, you're engaged in a worthless educational process because you have to battle.
That just doesn't follow. You have to battle, and that's what education is about. And battle in this sense means raise
objections. But if free speech doesn't exist anywhere, then the educational process...
I never said free speech doesn't exist. I said you have to be constantly vigilant.
Where does it exist? Tell me where it is.
Well, it exists here, if you take my point, which is it exists in the minds of the audience. It exists in their minds, in the ability for everybody in this audience to make up their own mind.
Isn't it?
Well, that's the thing. We have a depressing view of human beings now, that they're not up to it. You know, and it's often minority groups in Britain, you know, whether you're Muslim students, you're black, it's you who are told you can't make up your mind, so somebody who's white has to tell you what you should hear. Right? That's not acceptable. Right? The whole of humanity can make up its mind. There aren't specific groups that should be banned from making up their own mind because somebody in power or authority says, I'll make up my mind for you.
But what are students supposed to battle for here if freedom of speech actually doesn't exist anywhere in the terms in which you're talking about it?
Well, freedom of speech, I would say, is under threat in every single university for different reasons. Often now, it's not the clash of ideas in a threatening way, it's the idea that you must teach people with respect. So basically, you'll learn not to say anything. So the silence that leads you to a therapeutic approach to free speech. You end up, if I say something that you find offensive, then I'm put into counselling rather than argued with.
All right, Dennis Hayes, we have to leave it there. Thank you very much indeed. Could I ask now Nagla Risk, please, to speak against the motion?
Thank you. This is not about defending freedom of speech. At this end of the table, we are as committed to freedom of speech as anyone in this audience or on the panel. This is about the worthiness of education or absolute total lack thereof in the absence of free speech. It is not even about the extent of worthiness. Education is either worthy or worth zero in the absence of freedom of speech, and that is why I am on this side of the motion. I am here to defend education. I am here because of my education. I come from Egypt. I was born and raised in Egypt. I come from a family of doctors who were educated in Egypt, and for years they have been treating women, men, and children of their ailments. You want to tell me that this education is worthless? You want to tell some of the members of this very audience may come from repressive societies. Has their education been worthless? I argue that education is at the heart of planting a seed that will indeed bring about an intellectual capital and a reservoir of knowledge and human will that will turn to change things around and that will create the very freedoms that they see around them restricted. Education is a catalyst of change. Where do Egyptian bloggers come from? What about Tunisian techies who break the walls of internet censorship and create and find uncensored sites and share it with the world through the education that they have learned and through the democratizing technologies that are everywhere around us? What about women who learn to read and write and as they do that, learn to speak up against their abusers in Egyptian society? And I witnessed this firsthand. You want to tell me that their education has been worthless? Indeed, what's wrong with training that helps somebody find a job, provide for his basic or her basic needs, make a living for their family, promote dignity and self-esteem, indeed, in bringing to life Amartya Sen's notion of development as freedom? Is this education worthless? What's wrong with that? Education creates freedoms and promotes human development. Voting for the motion is not defending freedom of speech. In fact, voting against the motion is indeed congruent with freedom of speech. Thank you.
Nagla Risk, thank you very much indeed. You seem to believe that free speech is a sort of optional extra. You can manage without it in education somehow. But what's the message to people here? That, yeah, it's okay, you have a good education, but actually the free speech is a little bit of icing on the cake.
Well, you have a good education, and the value of education is a belief in the innate capacity of people to turn things around.
Wouldn't the Arab world be doing a lot better in a lot of other regions in the world if they had free speech?
Other things being constant, other things being the level of development, poverty, unemployment.
No, fact, they would, wouldn't they? They'd have more entrepreneurs, they'd invent more, they'd be more innovative, wouldn't they? You said so yourself, you're co-author of the 2009 Arab Knowledge Report.
There's nothing wrong with that. This does not mean that education is worth zero. It is about the worthlessness of education.
So a society that in your report is described as a one-dimensional vision that rejects change, creativity and innovation is still a valuable educational process?
Of course, education process will promote innovation and will bring about freedom of
an educational system rejecting change, creativity and innovation is still valuable? How is that possible?
Out of that system, I have belief in the individual capacity to ask questions. I am a product of that system, and I am here now.
Individual capacity is different from the education, isn't it? You're talking about two different things.
No, individual capacity.
People do things in spite of their education, not necessarily because, don't they?
Given the education, given everything around them, they will change. These are people who are exposed. This is not living in some la-la land. This is reality, and this is people exposed to the technologies around them, and they will bring change.
And the philosopher A.C. Grayling, who said, without free speech, there cannot be genuine education and research, you reject that, do you?
Well, another philosopher said that education creates freedom. Education
so it's your philosopher against my philosopher, isn't
well?
it? Marvelous. Thank you very much indeed. Now, could I ask, please, Tariq Ramadan to speak for the motion?
Yes, I'm supporting this motion exactly because I think that this black and white attitude by saying, oh, it's not worthless because it's not zero, is problematic. We have to ask ourselves what are the objectives of education. And this is the main discussion here. The objective of education is to promote knowledge, and knowledge is part of the freedom. The second thing is understanding, because knowledge without understanding, this is something which is problematic. This is the useful knowledge that we have even in the Islamic tradition, and we have to say to the people that this is very much the Islamic roots of everything that we are saying, but it's universal. And then to get what at the end? What do we want? Do we want autonomous beings, being able to think for themselves, to be autonomous, and to act in the name of the knowledge that they are gaining. And I think that at the end, what you are saying and what could be understood is that, oh yes, of course, education is always good, but there could be an education which is distorted as to the principles, and you support a system spreading knowledge without critical thinking. And at the end, critical thinking is to be able to speak, is to be able to criticize, is to be able to question, is to be able to contest and to say, I am free to say whatever I want. So the very essence of education should protect this dimension. If not, it's a distorted education, and it could be counterproductive, producing parrots and sheep, following the system, being able to say, and this is the problem that we have. Why don't we have change in the Muslim majority countries? Because very often we repeat. It's an education about repeating what is said. No critical thinking, no creativity. So this is the problem. So it's not a black and white. It's something which is come to the essence of education and come to this freedom of expression is the way you are giving me the means for me to be free, to be dignified, to be a human being, and this is where I can change the society. Because at the end, what we want is really this, is to be educated, to be dignified, and to change the society, to reform the society for the better.
Would you wrap it up,
Not
please?
An education that is supporting a system. We give you something to think with, but nothing to change the world with. And this is, for me, something which is important. And out of all the education that you can promote with this system is a lack of courage. You know what we need today? Students in the Muslim majority countries, but also in the West, having autonomy and courage to challenge the opinions of even the government.
Okay. Tariq Ramadan, thank you very much indeed. No autonomy and courage among the students out here? You don't find that anywhere? The students that you teach?
I want them to be more courageous, and I want them to be, all of us, you and me, we have to be much more courageous, to be able to stand for our thoughts, and then to promote a system. And then you were asking the question about us teaching in Britain, for example, or here. At the end of the day, it's not by criticizing and being passive with the system that we are going to change it. It's to be involved within it and to ask our students to be challenged.
Is it any better in the West than it is here? I mean, people think they're getting the whole truth and nothing but the truth in the West. They wake up disappointed to find actually it wasn't any truer than anywhere else, was it?
With your question, we are in a black and white attitude. We have many things to reform in the West. You know, when you tell to the people in the West, you are free to decide whatever you want, and they don't have a knowledge of history. You are free to be religious or not religious. No religious education. Religious illiteracy, and you are free. That's the wrong...
So education's pretty bad everywhere. This is what you're saying.
No. I'm saying that education could be better everywhere, which is not exactly the pessimist attitude that you are.
And better with what?
with the critical thinking.
I mean, what's their message? What's the message to people out here who have to live with restrictions in this region? What's your message?
No, the message for every one of us, and especially in Muslim-majority countries and in the Middle East, is be involved in education by reforming the system and helping the students to be able to speak and to speak out and to be free to speak out. This is the very essence of education.
Tariq Ramadan, thank you very much indeed. And now let me please ask Kevin Watkins to speak against the motion.
Well, I'm starting off by wondering whether Dennis and Tariq have turned up for the wrong debate. The proposition that we're discussing is that education is worthless without the freedom of speech. Bear that word in mind, worthless. It means no value, worth nothing. If something is worthless, you can just give it up. Somebody can take it away from you. Now, I say to all of you in this audience who are studying, maybe in countries that don't have freedom of speech, is your education worthless? Would you give it up? Does it mean nothing to you? Because if it means something to you, you reject this nonsense. This isn't about better education or worse education. The proposition is that education is worthless. Now, I want to give you a few reasons why you should reject it. Point one, you're being offered false goods here. The argument that our opponents want to put to you is that unless you've got freedom of speech, your education doesn't mean anything. This is the meaning of the word worthless. What I say to you is demand both of them. Demand your freedom of speech and demand your right to education, because they're both in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. They're both your entitlement. You don't give one up because someone wants to sell you false goods. Nelson Mandela said education is the most powerful tool that you've got to change the world. If you don't like your education system, if you don't like your government, use your education to go and change it. Another point, this word worthless, I work on Africa mainly. I work on education in Africa. The difference in child death rates in Africa between women with secondary education and women with no education is a factor of 4. Raising the level of education to everyone, of all women in Africa, to secondary level would save 2 million lives. Worthless? I don't think so. That depends on the value you put on a life, the price you put on human dignity, the price you put on ambition. Here's the last reason I want you to reject this motion. You don't vote for a motion that would deny to other people precisely the rights to education that you secured in your own life. That would be hypocrisy. You need to reject this motion. Thank you very much.
Kevin Watkins, thank you very much indeed. Isn't it all very well for you to say demand your freedom and demand your education at the same time? Easy for you to say, not so easy for them, is it?
Well, people do fight for their rights. You know,
they're not going to get both, are they? I mean, be realistic. They're not going to get both.
Well, let's get realistic.
Kids in the Middle East at the moment, are they going to get it?
Let me answer the question. Kids in Soweto in the mid-1970s fought against apartheid. That was school kids who led that struggle. If Dennis or Tariq had been advising them, they would have said, no, don't fight for the right for a decent education. Wait until somebody gives you the freedom of speech.
But you know from the report that you've worked on as well, the Arab Knowledge Report, that in many cases the education that is available in this region is not an asset, it's an obstacle, isn't it?
It's absolutely shocking. And that is why all of us should be working to change it. It's why students here, as Tariq rightly says, should have the courage of their convictions and work for change. It's why my organisation should be far more vigorously engaged in debates for change and trying to promote
And what
change.
does it say to you that not one Arab university is in the world's top 100? That their education is valuable? Is it leading in the right direction? Is this a valuable education?
If you're asking me whether all education in Arab states should be wrapped up because it doesn't meet certain standards that we would all like to see it meet, the answer is no. We should be fighting to improve it. There are plenty of universities in the UK that I would say produce pretty shoddy goods in terms of what they deliver to students. Do I want to close them down? No, I want to
What about
them.
Saudi schools that were recently in the news in the UK, for instance, for putting out textbooks? One of the textbooks asked children to list the reprehensible qualities of Jewish people, for instance. Another text asked what happens to somebody who dies who is not a believer in Islam.
Tim,
hellfire, the answer is given.
Tim,
is that part of a valuable education process
You're
or
hanging
not?
the wrong charges on me. You know, my organisation works across the world for developing curricula, working with progressive scholars and educators to challenge exactly
But do you think that is part
sort
of a valuable
poisonous
education
attitude.
system?
Do I think it's valuable to poison the minds of young kids? Absolutely not. Of course not. It should be stopped.
So
it
here
should be
is an
stopped
education
tomorrow.
process that is not
if
valuable,
that case
worthless
that
then.
you cite is correct, the Saudi government should be ashamed of itself. It should take those books out of circulation and it should get its act in order and do it differently.
All right, Kevin Watkins, thank you very much indeed. I'm going to throw this open now. It's time for you, the audience, to put your questions. This House believes education is worthless without freedom of speech. That's the motion we're discussing tonight. Gentleman in the second row, thank you.
Welcome, ladies and gentlemen.
Where are you from, please?
I'm from Qatar. So, ladies and gentlemen, my question is, since I'm 15 years old, when do you think we should bring debates in the schools?
Tariq Ramadan, would you like to take that?
Yes, I think that you are 15 years old and I think it's already time and you are a good example of what should be done and to promote that. The point, let me just say something about this question. We are not here talking about the value of education. We all agree on what you are saying. That the problem is that if we don't give you a space, a possibility for you to talk and to wake up and to have a critical mind, to question what is said by the teacher, I think that this is where education could be counterproductive. You are going to repeat what the teachers are saying. So this is when we have to start. 12. Even before that, we should let the students speak as much as they can and to listen to what they have to say.
Where is your belief in the innate capacity of the human intellect? You yourself spoke about the capacity of the human intellect. Are they sheep? You're going to teach students and they're not going to think for themselves on their own? Do they await an exogenous freedom of speech from their teacher? There is faith in the human intellect. I question. I learned wrong facts in history. I went and read and looked for sources to see how true this is.
Yes, but the point is not this. You are reducing, all your discussion is to say, oh, let us speak about this term worthless. It's not worthless. Education, when at the end we are missing the objective, which is autonomous human being able to criticize, to question, and to contest, is going to
that, in your view, is the worthless part. That's the worthless part.
The point for me, it's not even worthless. It's counterproductive. It's an indication of people not being able to change. The system is not helping us to resist the authoritarian regime.
Kevin Watkins.
Well, look, let me say I've got huge respect for Tariq because I live in the UK and Tariq has done an extraordinary job in challenging prejudice and bigotry in my country about Islam. But Tariq, I have to tell you,
this is the but he was talking
about. Here's the but.
Can we let him have his but?
No, there are no buts with our side on the freedom of speech. But here's the problem for you. You're complaining that we're discussing a motion which is about the worthlessness of education. Well, here's the bad news. That's the proposition you're defending. You're defending the proposition that education is worthless in societies where you don't have freedom of speech. Now, if it's worthless, you can take it away, wrap it up. Unfortunately, that's the meaning of the word. Now, I recognise, Tariq, that you would much rather be on this side of the table than that side. The bad news is you're on the wrong side.
Okay. He seems to be perfectly happy on that side. We'll take a question from the gentleman on the second row.
My name is Mahjoub Zouairi. I'm from Qatar University. My question, what is the outcome of the education without freedom of speech in the Arab world? When you look at the quality of students we have in the classes. I mean, yes, here. I am a person who taught on 3 universities in the world, one of them Harvard. And now I'm proud of being part of Qatar University. The quality of students I saw in Harvard, Durham, Jordan University, and Qatar University, it's a huge difference. The main thing I found is the freedom of speech. Without that freedom of speech, there is no education in reality. There is no education. So basically, what I say to you, education is not itself is important. We need to look at the freedom of speech. The quality of education always depending how much you have a platform to speak, to question, and to argue. And you are focusing on education.
Okay, let's have Naga Risk answer that. Yeah.
I too taught at Harvard, and I have news for you. Some of the students in Egypt are excellent, and I'm not talking about students who come from foreign schools. I am talking about students who come from the Thanawiyya Amma, from the Egyptian schools, who get a scholarship to go to the American university. That is the kind of students I mean. To argue that the quality of students across the board is poor is, I would say, is a false statement. These are the students in the Arab world. We talk of brain drain. Tell me, where do these brains come from? When our doctors go to England and excel, or go to the States and earn Nobel Prize winners, what are they a product of? They are a product of our universities. Can it be better?
let him answer those points. He wants to come back.
You are contradicting yourself. Those who are nothing in our region, when they go abroad, they become brilliant. Why? Because there is no freedom of speech.
Yes.
Exactly. This is the point.
Can I?
Because basically, I give you an example. One of the students asked me in my class, what do you think about Arab-Israeli conflict? In Britain, I can say whatever I want, freely, without any kind of concerns. But in the case when I was in Jordan, for example, this is what I was taught the same course, I have to be very careful in my words. So basically, it's very important freedom of speech is our oxygen.
Can I respond to this?
Yes, please, go ahead.
Again, we are arguing the wrong motion. This is not about more freedom of speech, more value, or more worthiness of education. This is not an ideal scenario. I'll go back to the brain drain. Is it an ideal scenario? No. But is this an outcome of our own educational system? Yes, for better or for worse. These are people who have been educated in this country. Not everybody leaves. Some of them are still around, and some of them are the ones who are curing the ill and the problems of poverty that we actually live.
Okay, I'm going to take a question from the gentleman in the second row. You, sir.
Mohammed from Lebanon. Bloggers are a product of freedom of speech. Do you honestly think these bloggers are purely based on the education clause? In Egypt, many are doctors, as you said. But do they work in their professions? Due to the power and corruption going hand in hand. Passivity is an issue. How would you respond?
Kevin, would you like to take that?
Well, freedom of speech and education are not either-or options. These are two fundamental human rights. They go together. One and the other, they're mutually reinforcing. Now, the problem is they don't always go together, precisely. But is the argument then that, given that some societies are restricting freedom of speech, let's wrap up the education system because it's worthless? That's what we're supposed to be debating. And I have to tell you, if you think of images of protest down the years, how many times has it been students who are on the front line challenging dictators and autocrats? Now, we all have to fight every day for freedom of speech. It's an absolute given. Freedom of speech without education is diminished on both sides of the equation, but these are not either-or options.
Tariq Ramadan, you want to come in there?
Look, why I'm on this side of the panel and against what you are saying. Once again, you keep on repeating education is worthless and we have to wrap up. This is not what we are saying. Of course education is good, but now, without the objective of education, and to be radical on the fact that we want an educational system helping our students and our kids to be critical and to challenge the system, we are not going to change anything in the Muslim majority countries and help our students to be critical in the West as well. This is the nature, the quality of education. And you keep on repeating about the fact it's worthless. It's the quality of education which is at stake here.
Then I'll go to Dennis Hayes.
What I keep repeating is merely the proposition that you're defending. Now, you can shift the goalposts as much as you want. The proposition that you're defending is that education is worthless without freedom of speech. I believe in the quality of education.
It is.
I believe in the freedom of speech.
Dennis Hayes, do you want to come in here?
Let's just be clear about the proposition that Tariq is asking you to fight.
Brief point.
Given that education is worthless in Saudi Arabia, Qatar, Kuwait, a few other places, Democratic Republic of Congo, Sudan, let's wrap up the education system. Because the word worthless means no value. No value means that when it's taken away, you don't miss it.
Okay.
This is a proposition to violate the basic human right to education.
Okay, Dennis Hayes, come in.
In answer to the 15-year-old who asked the question, really important one, it's never too early to start debate. and you can start it in your schools. And one thing you'll learn if you have debates for and against, every teacher should be doing, and I would blame the teachers, by the way, rather than the students, because they should be giving you the space to debate. And if they don't, you set up debates of your own. And then you won't do what the opposition have done, is play with words and change the meaning of the motion. It just doesn't mean what they said. Behind your view is a very... Behind your view is a clear view that somehow you pack information into students and one day they'll pop and burst into freedom of speech and criticality and change the world. It's not going to happen. They'll just become blocked like a drain. Right? Information is no good. It's the illusion of the information age that you just give people information without critical thinking.
So what's the message, James? Scrap your education system.
No, the message
Don't
is...
turn up for school.
The message everywhere. I've organised debates now for 6 years in British schools where there is a dearth of debate. And where you should go and learn to put arguments for and against whatever position it is, learn to think, learn to be critical, and stand on your own 2 feet.
What do you want them to do with their educational system?
What I want them to do, as a minimum, if they can't speak, is to feel guilty about not speaking, and wherever possible, speak your mind. That is your job as a student and as a lecturer. Speak your mind.
Nagla Rizk.
I want to answer the young man who spoke about the Egyptian bloggers. They are not a product of freedom of speech. They are a product of education. They are challenging restrictions on freedom of speech. The way our opponents argue is that freedom of speech is positively related to the worthiness of education. I don't disagree. I agree, other things being constant. The motion is not about that. The motion is about the starting point. Zero freedom of speech, zero worthiness. Okay. And I argue it's not at the origin, it is at an intercept.
Right.
You do have positive worthiness of education despite restrictions on freedom of speech.
Gentleman in the front row.
Thank you. My name is Ahmed. I'm from Iraq. What's the importance of individual freedom of speech without there being collective freedom of speech? How important is it for me as a student to say I oppose Israeli apartheid without having the ability to organize on my campus to boycott Israeli apartheid?
Tariq Ramadan.
Yes. I really want to thank you for that, because it's not only to be critical towards all the systems, but this is where we have to be today. To be able, in the West, to be critical towards the educational systems, because very often we have a problem also with critical thinking, and even the information. What is taught in our schools in the West is also to be challenged. And it's not only a question of students, it's a question of students and teachers and professors, all should be involved. It's a social discussion that we need. And the second point which is important is, with the educational system, we need to talk about what is happening in all our societies. The great danger in our society today, the greatest danger in our society is really populism. And populism is exactly the opposite of what we are talking about now. It's a lack of critical thinking. And education promoting populism and not critical thinking is a danger. Okay. So I would say that really education leading us towards this in the West or in the Middle East or everywhere is something that we have to oppose and to resist.
Kevin Watkins, you want to come in here? You've been scribbling furiously.
I don't disagree with a single word that Tariq just said. Of course, we're all in favour of critical thinking in universities. That is what education should be about. That is the purpose of education. It's that sort of critical thinking that gives people the capacity to imagine different futures when they're living under dictatorship.
You're shaking your head. Which bit of that do you disagree with?
If anybody's been to a university lately, they know that they're increasingly becoming isolated, elitist spaces where there is absolutely very much little and very limited connection to real grassroots movements. Throughout the world, historically, revolutionary movements haven't only come from masters or PhDs. They've come from farmers, people that have lived on the streets, people that have never read a book in their lives as well. So education without the freedom of speech to change societies is absolutely worthless.
Listen, this isn't a debate. I agree with you. I mean, the sort of education that's being described is not something that anyone on this side of the table...
You want to play musical chairs. You want to sit on everybody else's side.
The issue here, and here I want to talk directly to the audience on this, that, you know, the proposition that you're debating is on the screen there. This House believes education is worthless without freedom of speech. Now, you know, I work with people around the world, with women who are desperately trying to get their kids into school because they believe in education. They don't believe in the sort of education that Tariq is holding up. They believe in an education that's going to create opportunities and a future for their kids. You want to vote to take that away from them. That's the right you're challenging.
All right, lady up there, you have a question. Yes, you. Yeah.
Good evening. I'm from Pakistan, and my question is to Dr. Rizk. You spoke before about how in Egypt doctors are, their education is not worthless, but if we bring this back into the context of students who are studying in the Middle East, what would you say to students who are studying politics or students who want to become journalists in this region? We use our education as a tool. And so if in class we're not allowed to challenge ideas or to use our critical thinking skills to expand our ideas, then how do you think that our education will be worth anything in the context of the world living in the West as well as the Arab world?
Not the risk.
That is a very good question, actually. It becomes more challenging in areas such as journalism and political science than it is in the hard sciences. But I'll tell you, you are studying journalism or political science. Are you restricting your learning process to your books and your teachers? Are you not exposed to the internet? Are you not able to voice your opinion using the technologies that are democratizing everywhere? Do you not have, I have faith in your intellect, in your ability to sift and to selectively go through the information that you need. Is this ideal? No. Would it be better in the presence of freedom of speech? Yes. Is it worthless? No.
I mean, you're entirely right. I mean, the opposition are just basically punning on the word education. They're taking education to mean education with critical thinking and then just saying that that's what will happen if in the best possible world. The difficulty is where you don't live in the best possible world. And the previous speaker made the point about social freedom, but don't dodge the responsibility. In the absence of social movements, the only way of getting to those situations if you as an individual speak up.
All right, the gentleman in the front row.
Mohammed Abdul Malik from Qatar. Who defines the matrix of freedom of speech? Once upon a time there was a mosque who told us to do this and that. Another time, another era, there was a church. Now the freedom of speech, who defines it? Who defines this matrix? Who says what's right, what's wrong? Who sets the guideline?
I think it's a good question. It's not our question here, but it's a good question. At the end of the day, we have to go for something which is in our society to be free to question. And from an Islamic perspective, because very often what I got from people talking about Islamic majority countries that in Islam we don't go as far as this. It's wrong. In Islam, according to the Islamic tradition, even when you go to a mufti, when we go to an alim, you question, where do you come from with this answer? So you have to come with this. Freedom of speech is one of the objectives. So if you miss the objectives, you have to ask yourself, what are you doing with the means?
I totally agree with you on this side. However, on the other side of the table, they're talking about something even more noble. If you are serving 1 billion people, they are serving the other 5 billion people or the 6 billion people on the planet. When she says a piece of paper will feed someone, if I give this piece of paper to someone in the street, he can make use of it. However, if I go to him and tell him freedom of speech, they did not reach that in Congo. They did not reach that in some areas of the world. We are still in step 1. So why aim for step 100? We keep it over there. We keep step 100 where it is and aim for it.
I'm sorry. This is why we are not changing anything in many of the Middle East countries. You know why? Because they say it's a first step. We don't have an objective. We don't want to change the society. Let's give the basic knowledge for the people to be quiet. To be quiet means to get the salary and not to come with critical thinking. So this is the point.
Sorry, we are sitting here in Qatar and we are talking about freedom of speech. If you were in Africa, if you were a parent of children who are dying of AIDS, if you have children you cannot feed and somebody talks to you about freedom of speech, you will either laugh or be offended. This is a reality. This is not an ideal world. Yes, freedom of speech is wonderful and we debate it, but I'm not defending governments who use that argument. I am talking from the real world, a world of mothers and children who are dying of hunger and of disease. You cannot advocate freedom of speech, worthy as it is. It's a different argument.
I'm sorry, you are talking to me as if I was a father of a kid and I want him to go to school. Of course I'm going to this, but we are not talking about this now. We are talking about evaluating education in a society. Are we going for just one, I'm going to put my kid, or I'm going to change the system for my kids not only to get the money, but to be free? Because at the end of the day, to survive is a basic right, but to think is a noble right. And I want novelty. I don't want only basic rights.
Okay, I'm going to take a question from the lady in the third row. Yes, you. Yeah. You have your hand up.
Assalamu alaikum. My name is Basma Abdul Ghaffar. I'm from the Qatar Faculty of Islamic Studies. I just want to say that education is counterproductive without freedom of speech, because what we're doing is producing generations of individuals that are reinforcing the conditions for their oppression. No mother looks at her child and says, I want to put them in an education system that is going to reinforce the conditions of their poverty.
Okay, Kevin Watkins, do you want to respond to that?
Well, I think we're in a little bit of danger of getting stuck in trench warfare here. The truth is, generations, before you spoke about social justice, social movements have fought for generations for this idea of universal human rights. You know, the idea that you have a right not to be enslaved, you have a right to a decent education, you have a right to the freedom of speech, and you should defend that right at all costs.
Okay,
now,
I want to hear back from the speaker in a second. So.
But how are we going to do any of that if we can't speak to begin with? I teach, and my students look at me at the end of the semester like, what are we going to do? What do you mean, what are you going to do? They just don't get it. They don't get that they are allowed to speak, and they're allowed to be critical, and they're allowed to write to newspapers, and they're allowed to say, we don't agree with what's happening, and we're going to keep talking, and we're going to keep acting till something changes. Otherwise, I'm simply graduating people that are going to reinforce the conditions that they hate. And that's not going to get us anywhere. I think that's counterproductive.
So your students are free to say whatever they want?
Yes, and I'm free to say whatever I want in my classroom.
Dennis Hayes, you want to say something?
What we have now is an argument that used to be used for slaves. Right? When your lot gets better, right, we'll look after you more. The best thing you can do is speak up wherever you are. It used to be the case that if you were fighting against any form of oppression, you did it by speaking up and fighting and arguing and actively organising against it. Now, everybody in authority tells you, wait. Wait till some time in the future. Be happy slaves. Right? Whether you're a slave, you're earning enough money, you're on a training course to be an engineer, whatever, don't bother thinking. Don't bother fighting your oppression wherever you are. Don't bother arguing with people in Africa who are rulers who don't even believe in AIDS. Don't take any arguments about GM crops and say, we're not eating them, we'd rather starve to death, because you're not having the arguments. It used to be the fundamental condition that the fight for equality, human dignity, was premised on the freedom of speech, that you had to argue for it. That is why this motion is so important, because we've lost, or people in power have lost the idea that freedom of speech is important. And what they've lost, really, and you ought to remember this, they've lost faith in you. They've lost faith in human beings, wherever they are. And I do find it really patronising. You can say whatever you like about anybody in another country, and they can argue back with you. That should always be the way it is. If you say something critical about them, they can argue back. But you should not be told you're not allowed to say that.
Okay, I'm going to take a question from the lady right at the back. Yes, you. Yeah.
Good evening. I'm actually a teacher.
Where are you from?
Mauritius. I consider myself an educator. And before coming to this debate, in our classroom, we discussed with our students the meaning of freedom of speech. And we discouraged them, funnily enough, from trying to find a definition in a dictionary, because we really wanted them to understand about freedom of speech. So my question is, how can you understand about freedom of speech if you have no education?
You've answered your own question, right? And it is a difficult issue to say what freedom of speech means today. And I do think the only way you do it is by debating it. You exercise your freedom of speech to understand it. Because so often, people in British universities will talk about having a safe space in which they can express themselves without anybody being offended. That's not freedom of speech. Freedom of speech is your right to say to other people, I disagree with you, and I'm going to reason and argue with you till I change your mind. That is what free speech is about.
Yes, but you're missing the point. If you have no education, how can you question anything? How can you develop any critical thinking? So if you're saying that education is worthless without freedom of speech, then it's going to be a very, very sad world that we live in.
Look, you are responding to our question. What have you done with your students? You decided not to give the answer, to let them discuss.
I agree with you, but this is not the motion. The motion is education is worthless without freedom of speech. You did not define what education is.
No, but the point is the quality of the education is exactly this. Your education has a value because you give them the space to speak. If you were to give them the answer, it wouldn't be education. It would be just to give them the right thinking and then you have to repeat. This is not what you are doing.
Okay, Nagla Risk.
Two things very quickly. Dennis keeps undermining the value of training that gets people a job. Why do we undermine that? This is very important in reality in people who can hardly meet their basic needs. My second point is, if we assume that people who are given an education that is not ideal, that is not critical, we are really putting very little faith in their capacity, their intellect to question. We are assuming that people will sit and listen and will be driven like sheep. You talk about having faith in the intellect of students. If you do have faith, then accept, not try to change, but given the reality, whatever education they will get, they will be smart enough to question it.
Well, we have lost.
It's not an ideal scenario, but it is still not zero.
Okay, we'd like to go on much longer, but we're running out of time. I'm going to ask each of the panelists for one sentence, 15 seconds, summing up their views before we get to vote on the motion. Dennis, would you like to start? 15 seconds, no more.
Education is about your right to make up your own mind. If you vote against this motion, you're voting against yourself and your own ability to make up your own mind. So we want 100% vote for the motion.
Tariq Ramadan.
Yes, I think it's a very important motion. We can play with words and say, okay, the motion is about worthless or not. This is not the point. The point is about the quality of education, and this education should have objectives, and the objectives is freedom of speech and to challenge the system and the opinions of the people.
Kevin Watkins.
Well, you vote against the motion and you vote for us. You get two things in one. You get everything they're asking for, which is freedom of speech, 100% commitment to critical thinking in education.
Okay.
But you get one additional thing.
No,
you don't get to violate.
You don't get an additional sentence. Nagla Risk.
The motion is not about the quality of education. The motion is very clear about the worthlessness of education in the absence of freedom of expression. Defending freedom of expression does not mean that you vote for the motion.
Okay.
Voting against the motion is not voting against freedom of expression.
That's it. Thank you. We've come to the point where we're going to vote on the motion. This House believes education is worthless without freedom of speech. Would you please take your voting machines? Let me just explain to you. If you want to vote for the motion, that's the side represented by those on my right. It's button 1, the yes button. If you want to vote against the motion, that's the side represented by those on my left. It's button 2, the no button. Whichever button you want to press, please do it now. All right, there it is. 53% for the motion, 47% against. The motion has been carried. All that remains for me to do is to thank our distinguished speakers. Thank you very much indeed. And thank you to you, the audience, as well, for your participation. The Doha debates will be back again next month. Till then, from all of us on the team, have a safe journey home. Good night. Thank you very much indeed. Good night.